Good evening and welcome to the American Enterprise Institute. These chairs we got here are from the set of Star Trek, The Next Generation, the TV show from the 80s. And we purchased them especially for this new home of ours here on Think Tank Row. And I wanted to welcome all of you who have not been here before and who managed to not go to the old building, but to our new building to actually be here on time. So our discussion tonight will focus on the role played by big data in the 2016 presidential election. Big data here mostly is a sexier sounding way of referring to voter predictive analytics. I don't think, but maybe we'll hear disagreement on that political campaigns are at the point where they're genuinely overwhelmed by the amount of data they have access to and they can work with. It is meant to be a catch-all term for technological innovations that have allowed campaigns to combine and exploit data sets to deepen relationships with their supporters, as well as to identify, persuade, and turn out voters. Such innovations have, according to some observers, fundamentally changed the nature of US presidential campaigns and have become indispensable for candidates who want to remain competitive. Now, there's certainly no consensus around that view of the fundamental transformation. The two parties, as well as different primary candidates, have differed in their attention to analytics during past cycles, as well as during the current one. Now, to discuss and analyze these changes, we have a panel here of outstanding speakers drawn from both academia and professional practice. They will all deliver opening remarks. After that, we will have a discussion between the panelists with my colleague, Carlin Bowman, and me adding some questions in as well, and then we will open it up to Q&A for all of you. This panel is being live streamed as well as recorded, so whatever vicious insults you hurl toward us are on the record. Our first speaker, Professor Daniel Kreis of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, will provide historical and organizational context on how presidential campaigns have evolved as the technological frontier shifted. It will also help us understand how situations can arise in which two parties find themselves situated differently when it comes to developing capabilities and staffer networks. Situations that in many traditional political science models of electoral competition would not necessarily arise. And for those of you who would like to learn more about his work, his new book, Prototype Politics, Technology-Intensive Campaigning and the Date of Democracy, is available for purchase outside. And if you want it signed, then you can harass Professor Kreis after the panel. After his remarks, we'll turn to the first of our two practitioner speakers, Alex Lundry. Alex is a co-founder of Deep Root Analytics, where he works as chief data scientist. He's worked in a variety of data and polling roles, including as chief data scientist for Romney 2012. He'll give an overview of what data science and analytics look like in a campaign setting, what data are used, how are models used to structure the data and to interpret the data, and also literally what does some of the output look like on this screen. And then Patrick Ruffini will be our third speaker. He'll discuss how to use voter files to understand the structure of the electorate and how this differs from interpretations derived from more traditional exit polling. Patrick is the co-founder of Echelon Insights, which combines polling, modeling, and social data to measure audiences and optimize message delivery. He worked for President George W. Bush's campaign in 2004, and he directed the RNC's digital strategy in 2006. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Daniel.
Great. Well, first of all, let me just say a big thanks to AEI for hosting me. This is a wonderful event, and it is an honor to sit up on stage with people like Alex and Patrick, who dedicated dozens of hours to helping me understand their work and the evolution of campaign practices when it comes to tech and data over the last 20 years. So what I want to do today is provide exactly that big frame on sort of how campaigning is new technology intensive and why data is increasingly important for campaigns more broadly. But first, I want to make the point that data in politics is not new. So one of my favorite examples of this is William Jennings Bryan. The historian Michael Kazin tells us that on average, Bryan received 2,000 letters and telegrams a day during his first campaign for the presidency in 1896. Over 250,000 letters in all. And Bryan's brother and wife had the really brilliant idea in 1897 was to create a card file of all these letters that he got. And what they did is catalog them based on party affiliation, job, religion, income, things they cared about in their lives. And they updated that file for 30 years. So it had 200,000 names in 1897 and over 500,000 by 1912. And they used this really to send out regular mailings to the Bryan network to keep people very much engaged in Bryan, and that fueled the run and provided infrastructure for a number of his campaigns. All of which is to say that data in politics is not new, nor is this idea of sending targeted, strategic mobilization communications. But it grows much more sophisticated over the course of the 20th century as campaigns and political organizations get better at figuring out how to have scientific knowledge of the electorate. And this is a really broad and complicated story that I could talk for hours on. But in general, with the rise of the census and direct mail and geographic information software, more broadly, campaigns get much better at understanding the electorate over the 20th century. The key part is that it's a lot, data becomes more important in part because we now have much greater audience and electorate fragmentation. This is a quote that I really love by Michael Slaby, who's the Chief Technology Officer for Obama 2008 and Chief Integration and Innovation Officer for Obama 2012. And one of the points that he made when I sat down with him after the 2012 campaign to ask him about how it was different than 2008 was that that team that was walking into 2012 realized that the world had changed. It moved on them, right? Technologies changed, platforms changed, entirely new things arose. And more broadly, the general story that I like to think about of why data and technology is increasingly important is because in the 1960s, you used to be able to reach over 80% of the electorate running an ad on big three networks during prime time, right? To do that now would require a media buy across hundreds of different platforms and hundreds of different mediums. So what's important is that campaigns need to muster many different data sources from many different platforms in order to figure out how to reach the electorate, how to get their attention, and then ultimately what to say. Let me just give you one example that Slaby was referring to. This is a shot of Obama's re-election tweet from the evening of November 6th in 2012. I remember very frantically sort of searching through the index of my first book to figure out what role Twitter played in the 2008 election. And buried in the footnotes there was Teddy Goff, who was the digital director for Obama 2012, telling me that in 2008, some intern basically was responsible for Twitter. And indeed, Obama's announcement for his election tweet that night in 2008 was retweeted 157 times. Amazing, right? This tweet in 2012, 4 years later, more than 800,000 times in less than 3 days, right? So entirely new platform that campaigns need to figure out how to manage, what to use it for, and ultimately how to reach supporters and members of the electorate on. Let me give you one example from this election cycle. Again, technological change and audience fragmentation, much harder to reach the electorate. I sat down with a number of digital directors working on 2016 bids, including Bernie Sanders' social media director. One of the things that he told me about this election in particular was that they needed to figure out new ways to reach millennials, right? So they looked out across the landscape and realized that Snapchat in particular had a much younger base, the youngest base of any platform, and no interaction more broadly, so campaigns can only send messages out. Now, for anyone who's taught an undergrad class anytime recently, you know this is true. The one social media platform all of my undergrads are on constantly is Snapchat, right? Didn't exist in 2012. It is a new technology and a new way to reach voters. And we might want to dismiss it, but at this point, and this is something that Sanders' social media director made a point to me, Snapchat has more users than Twitter at 150 million. including 41% of 18 to 34-year-olds, and 2/3 of those 18 to 34-year-olds are actually registered voters. All right, so key medium and key way you're going to reach millennials, at least in swing states. And in order to do that, you need to figure out how can we muster data to figure out what sorts of messages are going to use and how we're going to reach people. Okay. As a result of these changes, so as we get increasing media platforms, as we get more and more data and the broader fragmentation of the electorate, campaigns have needed to build much more developed technological and data infrastructures, which now underlie all aspects of contemporary campaigning. This is the data architecture of the Obama 2012 campaign. And the broad point I want to emphasize here is that data underlies all aspects of contemporary campaigning. And campaigns need to figure out how to use digital as well as other platforms in order to figure out which people to say, what people to reach, how best to reach them, and ultimately what do you say. And just to pick out a few illustrative examples, if you look in the bottom there, and I know Patrick is going to talk about this in a minute, that's where the Democratic Party's voter file lives. A lot of the voter file is based on public data that then gets supplemented with things like commercial data, as well as historical data. So every time a canvasser shows up at somebody's house, they make contacts and that data goes back into the voter file. Analytics team use that data in order to figure out broadly which voters do we need to reach, and that means who are our supporters that we need to turn out on election day. Who are those undecideds that we need to try to persuade? What sorts of appeals broadly can we make for them to bring them on over to our side? And all that data informs everything else a campaign does. So in the upper left that you see here is Vote Builder more broadly. So that's the Democratic Party's field canvassing tool. So every time the party or the Hillary Clinton campaign dispatches people out into the field, they're using that technology. Up top, you see things like the media optimizer, right? So in 2012, the Obama campaign used data to figure out when certain groups of voters that the campaign wanted to reach was going to be more likely to be watching television, what hours of the day. They used data for that, and then they figured out ways to run those campaign ads at that moment in time. All of this is important because data helps, again, campaigns figure out who do we need to reach and how best to reach them. As a result of this new technology-intensive basis of campaigning, one of the things that I chart in my book, and I know this is a little hard to see, but I'll walk you through it, is just the increased hiring in the areas of technology, digital media, data, and analytics much more broadly in this world. So just to sort of look, if you look sort of over time, we go from Bush in 2004, having about 6 staffers broadly in tech, digital media, data, and analytics. There's a lot of other staffers at the party. Patrick was one of them as well. On down to looking at a campaign like Obama's in 2012, where they're hiring 342 different staffers in these areas more broadly. The other thing that was really important and really surprising for us when we put together this data set, what we did is we used FEC filings as well as other records and compiled a list of every staffer who's worked on a Republican or Democratic presidential campaign from 4 to 12, and then used LinkedIn to download their entire professional histories. One of the things that we found is that in order to keep pace and innovate in this area and era of technology-intensive campaigning, they had to draw a significant number of staffers from actually outside the political field. So on the Obama campaign, for instance, only 21% of Obama's staffers in tech, digital media, data, and analytics actually had previous campaign work in this area. 21% primarily had their careers in the political field. This might be a political party organization or working for a group like AEI. But 17% were coming from the commercial sector. That includes people who came from doing like billing systems, for instance, for mobile telephone technology companies. And 14% from the tech sector or the data and analytics sector. So one of the things that was shocking in the book that I found, but in order to keep pace and to innovate, campaigns had to draw talent from other places, not just in politics, and actually work to deprofessionalize their staffs in a lot of instances in order to draw people with different talents, technologies, sets of skills, et cetera. Another finding in my book, however, was that there were big differences between the two parties, and we could talk about this a little bit more. But when we look just at the top line numbers of staffers and hiring by presidential campaigns from 2004 and 2012, we found that Democrats hired 507 staffers in these areas compared to 123 Republicans, all right? So significant differential, again, in terms of hiring this digital, this tech, this data, and this analytics talent more broadly. And even more, one of the things that was very surprising to us, but I think really tees us nicely into thinking about the 2016 cycle, is that the Democratic Party built a much deeper bench. And that bench not only works at the top of the ticket, but also in my home state of North Carolina, I see Obama 2012 veterans, for instance, now working on gubernatorial and Senate campaigns, and even all the way down to even state senator races. So there's that knowledge transfer over time. We also looked at political entrepreneurship. One of the things that we found was that these staffers, and again, using this LinkedIn data, often founded firms. And one of the things that firms do, and here you see Alex's firm, Deeproot Analytics, and Patrick's firm, Engage, both up there. But one of the things that firms do is they work to house the innovations that presidential campaigns, which are comparatively well funded, produce, and carry them across election cycles, commercialize them, and also bring them down ballot races, which I'm sure Alex and Patrick can talk about, because I know both of their firms are great examples on the Republican side of the aisle of transferring knowledge that these folks gained to other races up and down ballot and across election cycles. But in general, what we found when we looked at this analytics map, and this went through spring 2014, was that 14 Republicans founded 15 different firms and organizations coming after presidential bids. On the Democratic side of the aisle, by contrast, much greater rates of firm founding. Now, part of this accounts for just they hired a lot more staffers. But also, more broadly, you can see the fact that there's a lot of entrepreneurship and there's a lot of market opportunities for Democrats in this space. So when we looked at the data, we found that 67 Democratic staffers who worked in this area founded 65 different firms and organizations. And this includes organizations like Blue State Digital, which provide a lot of the tech infrastructure for all the Democratic sort of email list building, et cetera. It also includes organizations like Blue Labs, which provides a lot of the analytics work now for the Hillary Clinton campaign, in addition to staffers. And just to give you one example of how these firms house talent, this is Matt Dover, who's the voter analytics director currently for Hillary Clinton. He comes out of Barack Obama's campaign in 2012, afterwards became the director of campaigns for Civis Analytics, which is one of these firms that spun off from Obama 2012. And then that keeps him in the political field and keeps his skills fresh. And now he's the voter analytics director for the Hillary Clinton campaign. And more broadly, if you look at this cycle, and here's where I'll end because it's sort of research in progress, but these numbers also hold up. So I just looked real quickly again at the numbers of tech, digital media, data, and analytics staffers on Clinton. And you're looking at about 70 so far, at least that I can track. Now, tracking these things are hard. I'm sure that number will grow at the end. Compared currently with 4 staffers on the Trump campaign in their offices. So again, this sort of disparity that might tee up differences between the two parties in cycles to come. All right, I will stop there and hand it over to Alex.
Great. Great stuff, thank you. Okay. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to talk about what we've got going on. So here's what I thought I'd do. In a very short amount of time, I want to take you on a very widespread and expansive journey through what a campaign data scientist does. I've been in this world of campaign analytics for more than 10 years now, really well before the terms big data and data science were even used to describe what we do, going back to 2004. And it's really been amazing to me to see how much this field has grown and changed just in that short period of time. And the amount of responsibilities that a campaign data scientist now has is really enormous. And so we'll take you through this very quickly. We're not going to go very deep into each of those. Some of these may be a little vague or uncertain to you about exactly what they mean or do. Happy to address them in the follow-up if anything piques your interest. But let's get started. So what does a campaign data scientist do on a campaign? These are the broad array of tasks that we face when you're embedded in a campaign and you're running a fully functional data and analytics operation. First and foremost, you are doing what is called data wrangling, which is you are the hub for any sort of data in the campaign. You are collecting it, you are bringing it together, you're tracking it, you're presenting it to senior staff and to other staff to help them better understand what is going on in the campaign. You're doing something called voter scoring and micro-targeting, which we're going to talk about a lot, I'm sure, during this discussion. You're doing things like figuring out who the campaign should be communicating with their direct contacts, their mail, phone, door knocks. You're helping them determine who they should be polling. You're helping them decide what number of votes they need to win and who exactly is going to turn out. You're going to be running forecasts and simulations to better understand what you think an outcome of Election Day could be. You're going to be figuring out exactly where you should be spending money in your paid media and how much should go to where and what you should be buying. You're going to be running experiments to figure out what works and what doesn't. And of course, you're going to be doing a ton of digital tracking. And so just to give you a better sense of exactly what some of these things look like, one of the first things we do is build targeting models. Now, this is an anonymized shade model. Now, you may not understand what those things mean, but let me give you a broad sense of what they are. When you build a model, you take the data you have about a voter and use that data to come to some informed judgment about how likely they are to vote, who they're likely to vote for, and what issues are most important to them. And the most simple of those models are what are called trees. They're called decision-based tree models. And you can kind of see the structure here. It's blurred out so we can keep it anonymous. But a tree is basically a series of if-then statements. And so it may be something along the lines of, if this person is a registered independent, and they drive a truck, and they have a hunting license, and they don't have children, and they read nonfiction, and down the chain, then that type of person has a likelihood probability of voting Republican of 0.95 on a 0 to 1 scale. And so we're using the information we have to make predictions about who these people are, right? And that's what a model is. That's basically what this model is. And we take these models and we build them for things like likelihood to vote, who they're supporting, and even things like undecidedness. And so this is a model verification. So this is an image that actually shows us testing the model to see how accurate it is. We're actually testing a number of different models in this particular chart. And this is a model we built in New Hampshire for Jeb Bush's primary run, where we were especially interested in finding people who were still undecided. And so that is another thing that can be predicted with what we do. And this is we're measuring what's called our false positive rate and our true positive rate, which is how good are we at predicting who's undecided and who isn't. Now, once we have those propensities on a voter, we put them together to create target universes. And the reason we do this is that we have a better sense of who it is we're communicating with so we can say the right thing to them. So for example, we can find people who are very favorable to our candidate, right, who are very pro-Jeb Bush, people that are not undecided, that we know have made up their mind, people that like the establishment candidate class set, because we very much saw that class of candidates in the primary, and people that are very mid to low likelihood to turn out. And when you combine all those together, you can look at people that are at the intersection of all of those things and say, these are our get out the vote targets. So these are people that we believe are voting for us, but we think they're less likely to vote based on our models. And so therefore, let's communicate with them in that way and remind them to get out to vote. But let's assume that they're with us. And you could also find people that are soft on you, but definitely voting, and communicate with them in a persuasive way, right? So that's the sort of thing. And that's really, those micro-targeting models, they are kind of the primary engine of any data-driven campaign, because that is helping you decide who you communicate with and how you communicate with them. You can also look at these targets that you create and better understand how they're concentrated by geography. And so here's a map of a particular target universe in New Hampshire, split by town. The darker red, the higher the concentration of that target. And so by producing analyses like this, we can present this to senior strategy, we can present this to the political team, we could target particular towns for events, right, or for door knocks. And we could be smart about how we allocate our resources geographically based on where these targets are most likely to live. We also provide polling sample. It's getting harder and harder to do good polling these days. And it's almost impossible to do good polling if you are doing random digit dialing, which is where you're randomly pulling out a number from the phone book, basically, and calling that number and hoping that it connects and hoping that it's somebody that's likely to vote. No, what we do is we use the voter file, which Patrick will talk more about, and we have the names and addresses and phone numbers of voters. We also know how likely they are to vote. And so we can be smarter about who we talk to and actually call more people who are more likely to vote, but also call people who are unlikely to vote. Because we do know, based on a lot of research, that even people who say to a pollster, I am extremely unlikely to vote, about half of those people still vote, right? So we still need to communicate and measure the people on that lower end of the turnout scale. So if we provide our pollster with better sample, they can have a more accurate poll. We optimize media. We can actually, excuse me, there we go. We can optimize media. So first and foremost, we can know where people are advertising. There's a data set that actually tells you that an ad aired by Hillary Clinton on this network at this time in this media market. And we can track the number of impressions that those ads have on our voters. And so what you're looking at here is tracking from the Jeb Bush campaign in New Hampshire of different types of advertising. So you can see the pro-Kasich line, the pro-Bush line, the pro-Christie line, and we can look at these things and know where people are advertising and know to what degree they're advertising. We can also even look at this at a program level and look at programs where we are out advertising the competition and where we are being out advertised. And that's what this chart is. The further to the left, the more that the Jeb Bush campaign was being out advertised. The further to the right, the more that the Jeb Bush campaign was saturating that target, right? We can also know what our voters are watching, right? And this is actually what the firm I'm at right now, Deeproot, specializes in, where we can take a group of voters as determined through the micro-targeting and actually find out what those voters are watching on TV. Now, we do it in an anonymized way and in a privacy-compliant way, so I can't look up, I can't find out what Donald Trump is watching on TV. I can't find out what Patrick is watching on TV. I can't do those things. But we can send over a group of voters and say, these are swing voters. And they can send us back anonymized TV set-top box data that says, here's a set-top box that went to this channel at this time, and I know that set-top box belongs to a swing voter. I don't know which swing voter, but I know it belongs to a swing voter. And because I know that, I can be smarter about what I buy. And so if you look at this graph, this actually shows a Nielsen 35+ rating. That's how most media is bought and sold, from Nielsen ratings on broad demographics, like people over the age of 35. And then the swing voter target rating, right? So the match that we did of our swing voters where we found out what they watched. If you just had Nielsen, you would see ABC at 4 p.m. has a rating of 2.7, and ABC at 6 p.m. has a rating of 2.4. If you just had that demographic information, you would say they're basically the same, right? So it doesn't really matter what we choose. Maybe we go with 4 p.m. because it's slightly higher. But when you overlay a swing voter rating, you actually find out that there are more than twice as many swing voters watching 6 p.m. And so that's a more valuable buy for us. And in fact, the network is probably undervaluing that buy. Those 2 hours of programming are probably priced the same by ABC. And we can take advantage of that and actually do some arbitrage here and get more lead on our target by buying 6 and not 4, right? So that's media optimization. I'll skip that slide. But then we do a lot of digital analytics on a campaign. So some of this is as simple as basic A/B testing, which you may have heard of, where you randomly assign visitors to your website, half to see one version of the website, half to see a different version of the website. And you can track your key metrics to figure out which version of the website is the better performing one, and then deliver that version to any ensuing visitors. And so this is one test we did on our mobile donation site. And so we A/B tested. Half of the people who visited mobile to donate got the hero image with Jeb, prime there, and half got just give us your money, right? Just give us your money. How much are you going to give us? And so I'm just curious, by a show of hands, which one of these do you think brought in more money? How many people think the hero image brought in more money? How many people think the dollars brought in more money? It was the dollars that brought in more money, right? And that's why we test this stuff. And that's really the kind of cultural and effectiveness reason to do this sort of testing, is that for years and really decades, we've relied on kind of our gut and said, oh, I think this will work better. But no, we can actually test these things and monitor how effective they are and then implement the ones that are most effective. We also did this with emails. We actually randomly assigned different types of emails to people over a period of about a month. And these weren't things, you may have heard about subject line testing, where they send out, from 8 to 9 a.m., they send out to like 10% of their list 2 different emails with 2 different subject lines, and whichever one wins in the first hour, then they push that out to the other 90% of their list. We did that, but that's not what this is. We, over the period of like 4 weeks, actually chose structural components of email. Like one of them was the length, short email versus long email. And then there were a few others we did as well. And we would test these, randomize these over all the emails we sent during that 4-week period. And we were able to find things like, oh, treatment B had the largest effect on opening an email, and treatment C had the largest effect on clicking a link inside the email, but treatment B had a decent one too. So treatment B is something we should absolutely be doing. And then we, of course, track things like social media. This is actually Patrick's company's product that we use. It's called social listening, right? Or did I get that right? Optimize listening. And we can track Twitter share of voice over time. So we would look at this and see what is the Twitter conversation about the presidential primary candidates, who's winning the share of voice, what are they talking about, so we can go deeper into that and better understand what people are talking about online when they talk about our candidate versus the other candidates. We can also do things like monitor Google search trends. This is the Google search trend for every single Republican candidate during the September 16th debate. And Jeb is in red and all the other candidates are in gray. And so you can get a sense of when during the exact moments in the debate that search interest was surging in Jeb versus the other candidates. And you can actually use that information to help you craft talking points that go out after the debate. What do you push? What do you get on the website? Here's an alternate view of a different debate, a different way that we track this, which is which candidate won each minute of the debate, who had the highest search volume during each minute. This is from the February 13th debate. I love this chart because I think it's very effective. I hate this chart because of Jeb didn't do very well, but it was a very interesting way to look at the debate and to think about the debate, and we would be able to say, okay, when he was winning, this is what he was talking about. We also, of course, track candidates. This gets into a lot of the data wrangling work that we do. We would go to pollster.com. We would write scrapers that would pull in all the polling data. We would put it into our own dashboards. That's another big part of what we do is build dashboards. We would look at things like survey mode effects and say, oh, look, Trump is actually doing much better in IVR and internet polls than landline polls. And we'd communicate that to senior staff and talk about what that means. We would do things like track candidate visits. Again, we'd write pieces of code that would scrape National Journal in this case, which tracked all the candidates. We put it into a dashboard and track it. We'd also scrape and track prediction markets. You can put money on the outcome of these things. Small amounts of money legally in the United States and larger amounts not legally in other countries. It's legal in those other countries, it's not legal here. But so there's a thought that these prediction markets can be actually better in giving you an assessment of who would win than polling. Actually, side note, in the 2016 primary, the prediction markets failed miserably. Polling was actually much more accurate than prediction markets. We could also track Wikipedia traffic. And this is good because Wikipedia is usually the first result that shows up in search data. And so this could give us another way to measure search data. And we would do things like, I love this one. We created, I think, 10 different fake people in all 250 or so media markets and sign them up programmatically for every single one of our opponents' websites for the email so that we could see if they're A/B testing email. And we could also track the amount of time it took them to respond. And I especially love this one because if you look at Scott Walker there, it took them 17 days to respond. And so I remember I went to the team. I said, there's something going on in Walker World. This is really weird that it's taking them 17 days to respond to our sign-up email. And then the next day he withdrew. So I thought that was very interesting. And we can, of course, track elections. This was another one of the very big jobs we had was understanding the calendar. So we would build dashboards about calendar. We would track rules, things like that. We would simulate elections so that we could figure out where there were winner bonuses. So because of the weird rule structure in the GOP, there were some states that were winner-take-all, where there's obviously a huge winner bonus. But there were other states where there were kind of hidden winner-take-alls, or there were hidden advantages to winning. And so we'd actually simulate these and better understand where it mattered that we won. Of course, these are all March states, and we never even made it to March. But we would also track the results of elections. So we would do things like look at historical election results, cluster counties together to better understand how different counties perform, but then use that also to track and predict the outcome on election day. And so we would build apps for like tracking elections and use those to help us better understand most likely outcomes. So that, like I said, very broad, very expansive, very fast, a lot to consider, but I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about it more in the conversation.
Thank you.
Patrick.
So I want to talk today a little bit about how we can use these tools that Daniel and Alex have talked about to really better understand what is happening right now in this particular political moment over the next 47 days. So I want to start out in what I think is a fairly standard fashion. This might seem, for a couple slides, like a polling presentation. But I promise you we'll get into the nerdy stuff a little bit down the line. But this is a breakdown of how different groups have voted in presidential elections since 2004, according to the exit polls, and then I've added a column for 2016 and the two-way between Trump and Clinton, and what appears to be what kind of change are we looking at between Mitt Romney's performance and Donald Trump's performance. What really stands out about this election is that for every election leading up to, every recent election at least leading up to where we've been, college-educated voters and non-college educated voters, those with a degree and those without a degree, pretty much voted the same, and that was true for both whites and non-whites. In this election, they have gone in completely opposite directions, and such that Trump is underperforming where Mitt Romney was by 10 points among whites with a college degree, but he is overperforming the only group on this slide based on the polling data, which might be a little bit old and more pro-Clinton than some of the current numbers, but the only group in which he is overperforming is non-college educated whites. This is the more interesting slide to a lot of people. So you hear a lot of talk about this idea of there being a rising American electorate, this idea of you have increasing numbers of non-white voters. You have voters who are, particularly younger voters who are going to be voting for not just this election, but they're going to be voting for 50 and 60 years down the line, being significantly more Democratic and also growing their share of the electorate. So this really breaks down the share of the electorate based on exit polls, but also the census. And why that's important is because there are actually two major studies that occur every 4 years or every 2 years of the composition of the electorate. One is the exit poll, which happens on the day of the election, and they're going to polling places and asking people to fill out the survey, and this gets fed to the networks, and they use that to make projections that night. But also, after the fact, the census is part of its routine measurement of, as part of the current population study, also interviews around 60,000 people right after the election to give us a demographic breakdown of that electorate. And what has tended to be the case in the last few elections, at least, is that there are wide differences between what the census finds and what the exit polls have found. And so the census, in particular, has found that there are far more voters without a college degree within the electorate than the census, than the exit polls will. And there are also far more older voters in the electorate. A fact like this might actually maybe help explain why a candidate like Donald Trump, who thumbs his nose at this sort of rising coalition of minorities and young voters, why he might still be doing pretty well despite those demographic trends, is because the electorate, as is painted as according to the census, is actually more of a 2004, 2008 electorate as we would have thought about it in the exit polls. But how do we bring in voter files to confirm? There are some things voter files are good at, and in particularly measuring age. That is a required field when you fill out your voter registration form. That is something that is nearly always captured on a voter file in, I think, 45 states. It's required, and it happens on, it occurs and is public for pretty much every voter. And so the vote history from the 2012 election, people just, one of the things we also have on voter files is whether or not you voted in the election. And that tends to confirm the version that the census gives us in terms of 18 to 29-year-old voters in 2012, according to the exit poll, were 19% of the vote. According to the census, they were 15, and according to the voter file, they were 13. 65-year-old and above voters were 16% according to the exit poll, 22% according to the census, and 23% according to their vote history. So an older electorate than many pundits and many people have been talking about based on the exit poll. But this also means that, in particular, there is a theory also that Republicans are going to have to win an increasing share of the white vote in order to keep up with the demographic change in the country. Some people have bandied about the number they have to win 63, 64, 65%. If they're not going to win any more Hispanics, if they're going to stay under 10% of the African American vote, they have to win a very large and almost impossible share of the white vote. But it actually turns out that Nate Cohn, and who writes for The Upshot, which is a product of the New York Times, actually had a really great study about this back in May, where he did some of these comparisons between census, voter file, and exit poll, and found that actually Obama did better among whites than we thought based on the exit poll. He did actually somewhat better among blacks, and also, having examined precinct data, I'm not at all surprised by that figure, and did a little bit worse among Hispanics. So it wasn't quite as bad as the Romney campaign maybe had thought with Hispanics. And among older voters, he also did a little bit better. So in this sort of scenario, it might actually be the case that Republicans do maybe still have some room to grow. They still do need to get better, though, with all the data sets do agree that non-whites are getting to be a larger share of the electorate. It's a question of how fast it's happening and to what degree it has happened already. So certainly Republicans do need to get better, but there are signs of hope, at least for maybe a normal Republican candidate in some of these numbers. Now talking about how does this apply to the current dynamic in this election. So I thought it would be helpful to really kind of break down the electorate into three broad chunks. There's obviously so many different segments we can build about elections. I mean, you talk to a digital person and they'll tell you, we built 180 segments and we targeted them with 50 different messages. But I think for our purposes here, one of the things we want to do is break down this sort of this quote-unquote rising American electorate, which I kind of label here as the Obama coalition, defined it as any voter who is non-white and any voter who is 18 to 29 and college-educated white. This would be a logical turnout target. If you're the Clinton campaign or if you're the Obama campaign, these are the base voters that they roughly need to get out. And obviously it's not all about demographics, but it is a good heuristic for helping understand which side is Hillary Clinton trying to get out with the analytics operation that she has. And likewise, which side is Donald Trump trying to get out? And the clear answer to that is non-college educated white voters, who he has gone from potentially 61% for Mitt Romney. He's now at almost 65 among those voters, or appears headed to that number in a two-way matchup. And it actually turns out that is still the largest group among voters. And it is kind of in the exit poll, Trump's base amongst those voters was 37%, according to the exit poll in the 2012 election. We have them at around 42 here nationally. But in particular, they are concentrated more in swing states than in non-swing states, which is a reversal from 2012 when it would actually, Mitt Romney would have had to have won the election by 1.5 points in order to have won 270 electoral votes. So there's actually, if you go to the 538 average, there's actually right now a larger probability that Trump wins the Electoral College while losing the popular vote. Now, I'm not sure I completely buy that, but in this data, you can see how certain demographics, the Obama coalition is less in swing states than in non-swing states. The Trump coalition is greater in swing states than in non-swing states, and the rest of college-educated whites are about the same between those two groups. Now let's look at kind of some of the specific states, and I know the text here is a little bit small, so I will try to highlight that as best I can. But we've kind of arrayed each swing state by the share that each group represents within that swing state. And it's not too surprising. When I first saw this, I'm like, a lot of the polling kind of makes sense, because you're seeing Trump doing better in a state like Maine, which it's unlikely that he is going to win Maine. Obama won it by double digits, but they do allocate their electoral votes by congressional district, and the second district he is currently ahead in, according to the polling. You also see him with leads in Iowa, in Nevada, in close in Wisconsin, and with consistent leads as well in Ohio. Each of those states that I reference are in the top 5 or 6 or 7 on the share of non-college educated whites as a portion of the electorate. Even in a state like Nevada, which would seem like, why should Trump be doing relatively well there given all the Hispanics that are there and are voting in Nevada? It's because there's very little in between Hispanics and non-college educated whites. Most of the movement in this election has occurred with college educated whites kind of fleeing their somewhat traditional Republican roots, but there just aren't that many of them in a state like Nevada and in a state like Maine. But in states like North Carolina, in Virginia, Colorado, even Georgia, where there's lots of minorities and also lots of college-educated voters, Trump is struggling to replicate some of the numbers that Mitt Romney was able to put up in some of those states. And just to look at how we can analyze, I mean, this is more of an illustrative example of how we can analyze using dashboards some of these, the demographics within some of these states. We've kind of highlighted the difference between, so let's say in Iowa, which is a state which is about 96% white, versus a state like Colorado, which is increasingly diverse and has moved a little bit more into a lean Democratic posture in recent elections. But in particular, just looking at segmenting the electorate by just voters who have a high school education, or are very likely to have a high school education, which is a field on the voter file. So we can just look at those voters and see what is happening amongst those voters. So we just kind of laid it out. This is by age. So the older the voter you are, you're on the left. The younger you are, you're on the right. And here's the partisan breakdown. In Iowa, those voters tend to be older and more Democratic. So it makes sense that Democrats in Iowa are going to be more cross-pressured about their choice for president and may fuel a crossover vote for Trump than voters like who are the same demographically in Colorado that are already more Republican to begin with and are probably just lining up as they lined up in 2012. Currently, Trump is running further ahead of the 2012 margin in Iowa than he is in a state like Colorado, and something like this might be the reason why. And of course, no presentation like this would be complete without an electoral map of some kind. Not necessarily to say that this is what I think will happen, but I think if you were prosecuting this case, if you were saying, applying this theory to what an electoral map might look like for Donald Trump, you very well could build a map like this where he gets 276 electoral votes by flipping every true swing state that where non-college whites outnumber college-educated whites who are over 35, and flip Florida, which was very close in the last campaign, and you get to 276. But there are relatively very few scenarios in which this can actually, you can get over that 270 mark. There's very little margin for error for Trump because he has to win states that have gone Democratic in many cases in 5 of the last 6 elections, such as Wisconsin, Iowa, and Nevada. We can also use the voter file to look at turnout. And this one kind of jumped out at me because we break down as well. We can break down turnout rates in swing states and non-swing states amongst these different groups we've outlined. So essentially the Obama coalition, his turnout targets, and the so-called what would be the Trump coalition, the non-college educated white voters. It turns out that using a non-swing state baseline, turnout in 2012 for Obama for his coalition in non-swing states was 71%. That number jumped by 7 points in swing states. So minorities, young voters voted at much higher rates in swing states than in non-swing states, and obviously. In a normal election, even without any kind of turnout operation, you're going to see more competitiveness in swing states and as a result higher turnout. And that was true, but it wasn't as true for these conflicted college-educated white voters who only went up by 3 points, and for the non-college-educated white voters who also only saw their lower turnout to begin with, and they also saw their turnout only go up by 3 points. Trump's hopes at this point hinge upon him creating that same sort of enthusiasm for him and raising turnout rates for him as were raised for minority groups and various elements of the Obama coalition in 2012. This is that same data broken out by race. So you really see it didn't used to be in previous elections before Barack Obama became president, didn't used to be African Americans outvoted whites. That is a new development in American politics that we've only seen in the last 2 presidential elections, but particularly in swing states, their turnout was 85%, and for whites it was 84%. The biggest jump was among Hispanics. So they went from being 67% turnout in non-swing states to being to a 75% turnout in swing states. Finally, I thought I would conclude this presentation so far has included some elements that maybe hints that maybe it's not as bad for Republicans as we might think. And I do want to bring us back to the fact that there are major generational divides in this country that are apparent in the data. This, again, it's that age continuum going all the way from the relatively few people on the voter file who are 100 years old to people who just turned 18 in 2012. And looking at the partisan breakdowns and also breaking that down based on who was president when these voters came of age. You really see Democrats doing really well in the FDR New Deal coalition era, and that is still, the remnants of that are still present in the data today that we can see on the voter file. Voters who came of age during the Eisenhower and Kennedy era were slightly more Republican, but that shifted back during the Vietnam War, and late in the Carter era and the Reagan era, you see kind of the biggest Republican advantage that you see here. But ever since then, it really has been a pretty big slide for Republicans that has been masked by the fact that those voters are just not as high a percentage of the electorate as we might think, but they will increasingly grow over the next 10, 20, or 30 years, they're going to start voting at high rates. And if Republicans do want to stay competitive, they do need to persuade those voters to start voting Republican a little bit more. And that tends to happen, but it is as big of a demographic advantage as any that we see at any cohort of voters, that big swing. Fortunately for Republicans, during the Obama era, that gap has narrowed, because there does, throughout this data, seem to be a little bit sometimes of a backlash against the powers that be, against the incumbent president at the time. Sometimes it aligns perfectly with who was president, and such as FDR, and sometimes there's a little bit of a backlash. And there is a little bit of a comeback that's masked only by the rise in independence. So that is where things roughly stand right now. It's still there's still quite a ways to go, obviously. But we think that using voter files and using the 180 million records on a voter file does give you an advantage in terms of understanding the nature of the electorate, where things might be going, the ultimate makeup and breakdown of the election day vote. That helps campaigns we work with make smarter decisions about who to go after and who to target. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. First of all, I want to give the panelists the chance to attack each other if so inclined. Otherwise, I think I'm going to give Carlin the first question.
Well, I want to thank you all for just a terrific presentation. I really felt it was just a great short course in the modern campaign. But I think I'd like to start with a question for Daniel, then a question for the two of you. And we also want to get to your questions, so I'll try to make this very short. Daniel, do you expect the Democrats' advantage in terms of just an appreciation for the new sophisticated architecture of campaigns, and also the manpower that they have in terms of people who are able to do this stuff? Do you expect that to continue? And a related question for Alex and Patrick: what is it about the culture of the Republican Party that sort of kept the Republican Party behind, if you think that's the case? And I think certainly Patrick, who I should tell all of you had his first job out of college at AEI a while back. But Patrick, you wrote a memo about that after the campaign that was very influential, I think, for Republicans, in which you talked about the culture of the Republican Party in terms of appreciation of what Daniel's been talking about. Daniel, you go first.
Yeah, so broadly, I'll say this, and I think presidential cycles are really important, because the level of spending that presidentials can use really to support an ecosystem of consultancies, to invest in talent, to pull people in from across fields, and then sort of create market opportunities for new tech afterwards, sort of in their wake, I think are really crucial. And I think that when you look at Obama 2012, you're actually looking at the cumulative sort of investment in this dating back from 2004, and sort of over time that helped the Democrats create that bench. What I saw, and my book stops in 2014, so I think what I saw a lot after 12, the Republican Party, and then folks like Patrick and Alex launching new firms, new ventures sort of in this space, that sort of there was this sort of realization of this gap and significant new investments taking place across the Republican Party ecosystem. But heading into 2016 now, when I look at the primary candidates, I see Jeb Bush putting together a fantastic team. I see Ted Cruz investing a lot in the areas of tech, digital data, and analytics. I think Rubio's social media and digital folks were super talented more broadly. But at the top of the ticket, on the Republican ticket heading into November, is a candidate who hasn't invested really in the infrastructure of creating a campaign organization. Just one sort of point that I find really fascinating, and we could debate about what a field office means, but the Washington Post recently reported that Hillary Clinton just opened her 31st field office in North Carolina compared to 0 on the Republican side of the aisle. Now, again, we can sort of debate sort of what that means, but at the end of the day, there's staffers in those field offices, staffers who need to manipulate data, staffers who are going to be out there getting trained in new technologies and tools. So what I do think is that that advantage will persist in part because there is no comparable spend at the top of the ticket this cycle that will then have staffers to sort of pay it forward in the future.
Yeah. Alex or Patrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that when you evaluate Republicans versus Democrats in this space, there are a couple kind of vectors that you should look at. Data, technology, tools, methods. I would say that on all of those, we have come an extraordinarily long way in the last 4 years. And I would argue that we match, if not surpass them on many of those things. Mm-hmm. Then I think you have kind of money, people, culture. I think money, we've done a very good job of investing a lot of money into that. People and culture are the ones that you can't just kind of happen overnight. They can't happen overnight, and that's probably where we're still lagging, frankly, because people get grown by the work that Daniel did, like inside of campaigns. They found firms, they trained people, mm-hmm. And that takes time. Mm-hmm. But culture also takes time, and it's about people interacting with data. Now, I do think, for what it's worth, the fact that we had so many presidential primary campaigns that seriously invested in this goes a really long way in kind of equalizing people and money. My team on Jeb, I would say half of them were completely new to the analytics process. Mm. We spent the time training them. They were hired right away by the Data Trust, which is one of the institutions on the right, that they're now out in the analytics ecosystem doing good, doing well. And so that goes a long way. But also culturally, there's a whole team of campaign workers and consultants who worked with our analytics shop at Jeb and now know how to interact with us, know how to be sophisticated consumers of these things. And so we're getting there. It just takes time.
Yeah. Patrick?
I think there is, you look back at I do agree that in the last 4 years in particular, there has been kind of a wake-up call, and particularly like the autopsy, although it does get, the RNC autopsy, though it does get maligned a lot, was instrumental in a lot of that. But I think going back to the origin stories, having been in those like 5-person shops when, I'm looking at the sort of across the aisle and I'm seeing 50 people I'm supposed to face up with. It's kind of like this battle scene from Lord of the Rings or something. I was like, going back to that point, what is sort of the rationale that the decision makers have around technology, around data? And some of it goes back to the Republicans had traditionally done pretty well on some of the mechanical aspects and technical aspects of the campaign. They just aren't really talked about as being data or technology driven today, such as direct mail. The Republicans and conservatives invented the practice of direct mail. It took a long while for Democrats to catch up. In 2004, there were also, the voter data was actually, the Republican Party was far ahead on the question of, who had a national voter file, who had standardization across campaigns and across the ecosystem on that front. And so there was a sense, maybe, why innovate in some other areas when we have this advantage with small donors already? We do seem to have a pretty good story to tell when it comes to data at the time. Why go out and stir up, let's say, build an online community to when we already have, and maybe demographically too, a good match in some of these direct mail donors. So I think it was classic innovator's dilemma at the time, and it took a while, I would argue 2 election cycles, for the thinking to catch up that wasn't going to be enough anymore.
Yeah. Stan, a question from you.
Yeah, and it's kind of a logical follow-up. So there are certain campaign tactics that we kind of know how effective they are. There's work by Gerber and Green. Do yard signs matter? Door knocking. It's harder to assess how much a data analytics operation matters, also because it permeates everything. But I wanted to ask you guys to speculate about this. I think the Trump campaign, I think is doing much less on this front. How much of an advantage do you think it gives Hillary?
Well, I think we don't have to speculate. I mean, we run experiments, to measure the impacts of these sort of things.
Even better,
in the vein of Gerber and Green, where basically it's like a randomized drug trial. Imagine that. It's the same sort of idea, except we're doing it with things like campaign contacts and targeted versus untargeted communication. And so I think what we kind of consistently see over and over again is that a really good data and analytics operation that kind of is matched with a good kind of field effort is good for anywhere from 2 to 3 points. The analogy that's used all the time is we're the field goal unit. We're not scoring touchdowns for the campaign, but we'll come in and we'll kick the field goal right at the last.
And so that's compared to basically just doing rallies in swing states, and
just as opposed to being untargeted and just kind of doing it the way it's been done for decades.
But I do think like everybody, the rap on all the primary campaigns is they all had great data analytics operations except for Trump, and Trump wins. But I think like when you're winning states by 15 points, 2 or 3 points doesn't really. I mean, you won by 15 instead of 18. That's sort of the outcome, and in particular, when you have $2 billion in free media coverage too, that kind of also matters as well.
But the only thing I would add to this is to say that as Alex's presentation pointed out, that like as you enroll analytics in everything, right, it just increases your efficiency across the board. So I can't point to a percentage point difference, but like just imagine if Trump was A/B testing an email list for those small dollar donors that he sort of kicked in with in June, way back at the beginning of the primaries. Just think of all that money that now could have been invested in things like field offices, precisely to do the hard work of like turning out those voters that he needs to get to the polls. So, you're talking about like basically millions of dollars left on the table, presumably. That sort of having a digital shop and A/B testing and an analytics team behind it, in essence, could have generated far earlier on.
Yeah, and I guess I'd just emphasize there that analytics and targeting and all those things does make for more effective communication, but probably more importantly, it makes for more efficient communication.
Yeah, that's right.
And you can just raise more money. You can identify more donors, you can raise more money, which allows you to then in turn do more.
Yep.
And that makes a big difference. So while the targeting itself may not be responsible for a more effective campaign, it has an impact that allows you to just do more.
This morning in my email, I got an invitation to fly on Donald Trump's 757. And in the last few days, I've gotten an invitation to have tea with Ivanka, dinner with Hillary, all for a price, and to participate in all of these contests. And I'm just curious, what do they know about my social profile, and is the voter sort of getting lost in this? Somehow I don't think the word "hey" in a subject line appeals to my demographic, but it might. It's nice for somebody to think I'm young. But I'm just wondering, do you sense any kind of a backlash in terms? I mean, there are a lot of public concerns about data gathering. You're certainly seeing this with concerns about the Yahoo hack and other kinds of things. This is a big business now, data analytics. First of all, how do they know what they know about me? And what do you think the future of some of the concerns the public has about data gathering generally might be for your business?
I do wonder if that's going to become an increasing issue, but thus far it hasn't been, because people, I think, intangibly sense that there are some benefits to them giving up a certain amount of data to Facebook, or and that I get to use a social networking site for free, and I don't have to pay to use any of the favorite websites that I use. And yes, I get these intrusive ads that I need to install an ad blocker for. But when you actually ask people, to opt out. Now, that's probably a bad way of doing it, but when you actually ask people to opt out of tracking, relatively few people, single-digit percentage of people actually choose to opt out of that sort of tracking.
Well, I think, and the thing you asked where the data comes from. Pretty much any time you signed up for anything, you've given your name to anything, that data's bought and sold, right? And so there are these massive consumer data providers out there that basically compile these data points, and that has information on the American consumers that's accessible to us in a very different form when it's appended to the voter file. And so the caution I give about before you go all Big Brother here and freak out is that the data that's available is actually fairly imprecise and vague. It's precise enough to be useful in targeting, but imprecise enough so that it is not a true invasion of privacy. So we don't, for example, the example I always use is on the consumer file, there's a flag for whether or not you have a technology interest, right? That flag may be there because you subscribe to Wired Magazine. It may be there because you have a Best Buy rewards card. It may be there because you went to the Apple Genius Bar. I don't know why it's there, right? We don't know those individual things. We just know that you have a technology interest. And so it's helpful in targeting, but not so helpful that or not so specific that it's a violation. And in fact, I'd encourage you all, if you have concerns, there's a website, I think it's called About the Data, where you can actually go look up the consumer data that's stored by you by one particular company, Axiom. And you'll find, first of all, that it is not very specific, and that, frankly, it's wrong in many instances. And you may say, well, how can you come to all these conclusions if the data is wrong? Is that, well, for any given individual, you're going to find a piece of data that's wrong, but in the aggregate, it's right. Right?
Stan, another.
It also leaves a cookie that then Alex can use to track you.
That's right.
Yes.
Concerned about privacy.
I think we have about 15 minutes left, so I think we should turn it to the audience. Anyone have any questions for our
Question
esteemed
right
panelists?
here and two in the front. If you could just identify yourself and ask a short question. Gentleman right here.
And please introduce yourself and maybe state your affiliation. And questions end with a question mark is our rule.
Edwin Williamson, Sullivan and Cromwell. For Patrick, has anybody done any data compilations for the primaries in 2016 comparable to the 2012 data that you showed, the exit polls versus the census and so forth, by demographic group?
Yes, I mean, I think there's been a variety of analyses run, and one of my favorite things during the primaries was where you didn't even necessarily have to wait until a primary happened to know how another state was going to vote. I know, Alex, I'm sure you were doing this, but you could go to 538, you could go to the upshot, you could basically see highly accurate predictions about which states would vote which way when there was zero polling based solely on demographic factors. So on in particular, this mattered for things such as the delegate hunt, when it was in doubt as to whether or not Trump would get a majority of the delegates in terms of which districts we go after, because we know that there are a lot of college-educated voters in this district, and as such, we think it's a good target for a non-Trump candidate. After the first few primaries, it sort of became clear what the demographic patterns were going to be throughout the rest of the primary season. Now, I would argue after a certain point, momentum kind of just kicked in, and candidates dropped out, and voters themselves did not necessarily respond in the same way. And they just kind of said, all right, Trump seems to have won so far, and so we're just kind of going to give it to him. But you could still glean demographic patterns, and they were pretty accurate predictions, but didn't necessarily always account for momentum. Let's say voters at one point in the process, both in the case of Trump kind of starting to run away with it, and at one point Rubio just collapsed after he started, after Super Tuesday, there was a sense he couldn't win anymore, and so all of his voters moved to Kasich, and some of them went to Cruz.
This gentleman here.
Hi, Joseph Schultz, political data analyst with Scripps. My question is kind of a hope and interesting one, and I want to give it to the panel. In the universe of gainable voters, over the past couple of cycles, it seems like there's been a switch between the swing voters and the turnout voters, with turnout voters taking precedence. Is that something you see continuing this cycle? And what do you think that means for our politics in general?
Well, the first thing I'd point out is I think it's very much a function of which side you're on, right? So when you look at if you imagine kind of a spectrum where from left to right is likelihood to vote and up and down is partisanship, right? If you look at the corner that is unlikely to vote and Republican, and you look at the corner that is unlikely to vote and hardcore Democrat, there are orders of magnitude larger unlikely Democrats than unlikely Republicans. I mean, we're talking like 10 times as many low turnout Democrats as low turnout Republicans. And that's consistent across many states. And so because that's good news, bad news for Republicans. It means that, hey, the people who really like us, they're voters. And that's why we do so well in midterm elections, right? It's because they show up and vote. But it means that we don't have as deep a well to keep going to just get them to show up and vote and reliably vote Republican. The Democrats, however, have a very deep well to go to. And so Democrats, I think, more often than not, end up running turnout-driven campaigns, and Republicans have to run persuasion-driven campaigns. Now, you do both. I mean, at the end of the day, you always do both. But Democrats are much more likely to focus on turnout.
I would also say that maybe perhaps this election, you've seen a little bit of a rebirth of persuasion just because of the number of cross-pressured and conflicted voters, particularly among college-educated whites and things like that, that have legitimately flipped or are very much undecided between, in a four-way, and so you see this a lot in the four-way polling.
That's, and I would definitely agree with that. I think cross-pressuring in particular.
Okay, right over here in the back.
Thank you. I'm Barbara Tyron with EPRI. My question is for Daniel, although I'd certainly welcome the perspectives of any other of the panelists. I've noted, of course, that you all have talked about the increasing trends around data analytics and social media, particularly with the younger generation. But I noted that on Matt Dover's LinkedIn page, where he is the voter analytics director for Hillary Clinton, he has 454 connections. That strikes me as somewhat paradoxical given the trends that have been described here this evening. And I wondered if you shared that view or any interpretation you have around that.
Paradoxical meaning he should have more?
Yeah, up in,
You have to
for
get to
example,
that
4 or
500.
5 digits.
Sorry?
I was thinking 4 or 5 digits worth of connections at this point in his career.
It stops at 500 plus.
It's So, broadly, I mean, look, I think the broad sort of, I guess, response to that question is that there's many different social media platforms, and one of the things that I think we very much have seen is that we are in an era where campaigns have to figure out which social media platform is going to help them get the audiences that they want, and what are the genres and norms, and what ultimately are their electoral values. So one of the things, and I'm sure Patrick and Alex can speak to this too, but like Twitter, for instance, is kind of a very rarefied medium that campaigns use a lot to help set the agenda of the professional press, right? That's not necessarily where you go to reach those voters who don't really care all that much about politics, right? Sort of the inadvertent voters who just need to be exposed to campaign messages some other way. You go to Facebook to find those people. On Instagram, it tends to be younger, but it's also people who opt into political content because it's really hard to share content within social networks there. Snapchat, though, does seem to be sort of the one medium for younger voters. So broadly, I think LinkedIn sort of has a different demographic that tends to be more professionalized and for professional relations. But generally, campaigns look out at the world. It doesn't make sense anymore to just refer to social media because they're very different in terms of their audiences, their affordances, as well as their genres more broadly.
Also, in Matt's defense, his job is not to send people LinkedIn messages to persuade them to vote for Hillary.
There's a question right here in the front, this young woman. Here you go.
Hi, I'm Danwei Wang from Tencent. Our company owns the largest social media platform in China. My question is that I wonder if the results of the analysis shape the candidate's behavior in any way, because we will all talk about the presidential Donald Trump and the real Donald Trump. The other day I read an article about actually two people are writing his Twitter. One is from himself and the other from his intern, which are totally different styles. So technology help you to understand us, the voters, more, but do we use the technology to understand the candidates more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fantastic, that analysis, by the way, was fantastic. If you have not read it, I highly recommend doing that, because basically they decoded that based on the phone that it was tweeting from, that the words used were very different depending upon, and the tone was very different. It was great. Great data detective work. But yeah, and it's a perfect example of how technology can help us better understand the candidate. So I think you're absolutely right in that, it goes both ways here. And that you're seeing great examples of data journalism and people from places like 538 and Upshot and all these other places where they can use technology to better understand the electorate. You saw something, Patrick participated in a really fantastic project at the Upshot the other day, where the Upshot commissioned a poll, but then gave the raw data to 4 different pollsters and had them weight the polling differently. And you saw that the spread of the ballot was, I think, as big as 5 points, depending upon who weighted it and how. So yeah, I think it's great because it can turn the mirror back on.
To your point, though, I do think that one of the big untold, I mean, anytime people ask me, like, what should we look into in terms of I'm just looking to do a paper or a story on social media in the election, I'm like, how are voters using it? I mean, we've had a lot of really great research on, like, the things that campaign operatives are doing to try and manipulate and reach voters. But really, the interactions among voters are really fascinating to me, particularly like on Facebook. And we've seen this in so many different walks of life in terms of look at how the reactions to these these shooting incidents, of these police incidents throughout the country has changed because of the availability of camera phones. It's not that maybe these things were happening, but nobody had a video camera on them 24/7 before. And as well, the candidates, forget the candidates are also human beings who are increasingly sort of using the technology themselves. And I remember, back sort of very early on, it was like, don't ever go near Twitter or else you as a staffer will discredit the candidate. Now we have to worry about the candidate discrediting the campaign based on his Twitter feed.
We have a few more minutes for questions, so let's get a few on the table and then the panelists can choose to answer them. And then we'd like to invite you to join us for a reception outside. And there are also copies of Daniel's book available for sale. Gentleman in the front.
Hi, Tom Curry with CQ Roll Call. This is a question for Patrick Ruffini. Can you talk about the limitations of the voter file? Is a complete vote history available in all 50 states? You talked about age and how you can re-estimate what percentage of the electorate is 18 to 29. Is race or ethnicity part of the voter file in every case? Can you talk about how it's used and what are the limitations?
Yeah, essentially when we talk about the voter file, it is a patchwork of 50 state voter files, and they're maintained at the state level, and each of them have slightly different rules about which data points they collect, and including, notably, party ID and party registration is defined very differently from state to state. In some cases, it's not collected at all. It's not officially collected. It's simply a matter of if I go and vote in a primary for a certain party, that is recorded, but relatively few people do that, versus a state like Pennsylvania, which has nearly perfect party identification. And the voter files we work with will have some measure of modeled party identification, but that's not always perfect. And I think there's a great book by Eitan Hirsch called Hacking the Electorate. It really goes in deep into a lot of these issues because it's not really necessarily true that voter files are the be-all end-all in every case. That said, it is a very comprehensive data set of who voted, and that data is very good, and even down to very hyper-local elections, we can have that data. Sometimes I've seen in some states I get vote history going back to 1980. Sometimes though people move, they disappear from the file, they reappear other places. And so there are a variety of different things you need to do to make it, a little bit of a better resource. And it's not, no, you're right, it's not perfect in every time. I would argue it's better than a lot of the other analytical tools we have.
This is a very detailed question, I guess. The biggest gap between the exit polls and the CPS is on education.
Yep.
How much of it do you think is driven by the fact that the CPS just has more educational categories? Some college and such.
Yeah, that is.
Is it that group?
It's associate's degree. It's somewhat of a muddled. But although I think Joe Lenski has said, he runs the exit poll, has said, there is a bias. There might be a response bias if you're there. You're actually taking the survey in front of another person. You might want to. There might be some social desirability bias in there too. So certainly they're not measured in the exact same way, but there is a difference.
Question from the back of the room at all, or? Oh, okay.
you doing? This question's for anybody. I'm Landon. I'm DOD, but not forever. I'm wondering, as people kind of make a cocoon for themselves as far as the news they choose, and we have a lot of the younger generation actually cutting their TV and commercials. Have you guys thought about how you're going to target these people moving forward?
Yeah. So yeah, it's getting trickier, right? It's harder than ever to communicate with people, especially as you do see things like cord cutting happening. I think now, disclaimer, I'm in the TV optimization business. So, but I would point out a few cautions with this. One, we don't yet know if cord cutting is a long-term permanent behavior or if it is an age cohort behavior. So what do I mean by that? We don't know if that 25-year-olds that have cut their cord, if when they're 35 and 45 and 55 and they have children, whether or not they're still not going to have cable. And in fact, I think if you look at just the behavior of cable companies, they are becoming increasingly incentivized to really cut their prices on actual linear TV in order to keep those people subscribed. So I think you may see some market pressure to actually have people still watching live linear TV. And I also would point out that there's not nearly as much commercial skipping and cord cutting as you would expect. If you look at unattached millennials, so millennials who are out of the home and aren't married, who you think would be watching the least amount of TV, on average they still watch 2 hours of live linear TV every single day. And that there's a whole country out there that doesn't look a lot like the extremely educated and well-incomed, urban class, and they're watching a lot of TV. So is that changing? Is it becoming harder to communicate with them? Yes, absolutely. But is it changing as radically as we think? Probably not. And how long-term is that? We don't know yet.
So about half of the people who actually are cord cutters write about cord cutting for a living. I think that's part of the...
Well, and the other thing is that we rely a lot on survey-based measures. So when you ask people, do you watch commercials when you watch TV? Everybody goes, oh, no, I don't watch commercials. But I see the data. People watch commercials. You don't skip nearly as much as you think.
The only thing I would add to that in sort of the spirit of your question too is that much more broadly, I think social media creates new social network flows of communication and information that cuts across ideological boundaries as well as political attention. So one of the things that I think we see from an emerging body of research literature, admittedly, is that we tend to think people are in their own little filter bubbles and just choosing out ideologically constant media. However, on a platform like Facebook, where you're friends with your far-flung ties, the people you grew up with, extended family members, all of whom are sharing different content that might come across the ideological spectrum, you are not as isolated from opposing points of view than I think a lot of the conventional narrative seems to suggest. And it's one reason why I think campaigns try to create content that they hope people will share within their own social networks. And it has to be compelling enough to get them to share it. But it's one of the ways that I think at least targeting or strategic communications becomes more interesting and has to also harness social flows of information in new ways.
Well, please join me in thanking all of the panelists for an absolutely wonderful presentation. And join us outside.